Hi, everyone. This is your instructor, Mimi Hume, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of the idea of childhood. I think it's important to talk about that because we're talking about the history of the evolution of children's literature. And if we don't understand how children were seen in the Western world, at least, then it's hard to understand literature and how that evolved. So I'm going to talk about Phillipe Aries. He wrote a treatise called The Centuries of Childhood, A Social History of the Family in 1960. And what he was doing was responding to the idea that many people were having, that the idea of the nuclear family was being eroded and people weren't being, the kind of family that they were supposed to be, and doing all kinds of things that didn't promote family and family life. His thesis was, for his article, was childhood, Aries argues, is a relatively new concept that emerged around the 17th century, concomitant with such developments as a decrease in infant mortality, changes in the European educational system, increasing class stratification, and a gradual withdrawal of the family from a wider web of social relations. So his first point is that before the 17th century, the late 17th century, in medieval times, before the 16th century, the idea of a family, a nuclear family, was very different. He said that, and researched and historically discovered on his own, and I've done a lot of reading on this too, and so have a lot of other historians, and I generally agree with his philosophy, that if you were in a wealthy family, you lived in a large house with people who owed you money, with your relatives, with your family, with servants and other people who helped you, and oftentimes you sent your child out to a wet nurse to have him fed, him or her, and so the group that was raising the child was really a larger part of society. If you were poor, then oftentimes people in the village helped you, your relatives helped you. There were a lot of people living in a family. They grew up helping the family, working, and it wasn't just mother, father, and 2 children or 3 children or whatever it is that we like to have today. One of the reasons for this is that the child, as we know it now, which is we examine children psychologically, and we organize their actions and activities by their age. Before the late 17th century, when the clergy started keeping records, people did not know their birthday. So Aries calls it our curious fascination with our birthday. Like right now, everybody knows their birthday, and they're very happy when their birthday's coming, and they know how old they are and all those things, but they didn't know their birthday because nobody considered thinking about why they should know that exact day. Another reason was because of the instances of child mortality. Child mortality was very common. A lot of children did not survive, especially in the poorer families, but also in the wealthier families. So an infant was basically precariously balanced between life and death, and there was no real use or feeling that you needed to become very connected with that child because he or she might die. All right. Let's see. Okay, that child mortality. So in the 17th century, people began to be more interested in their children because, not that they didn't love them before, but in general, overall, became more interested in children as being a special nucleus, the special nucleus of the family. Games like snowball fighting, Halloween type games, and reading fairy tales or listening to fables or listening to fairy tales was for everyone. They weren't just for children, they were for everyone. Originally, they were really for just adults. But as time passed, adults began separating the idea that they should, or began to separate themselves from certain activities, and they became children's activities. Fairy tales and certain games and songs were for children. Also their clothing. They used to be dressed kind of as miniature adults, just on the path of life. Even paintings of children showed them with like smaller heads and almost like they're like just miniature full-grown adults. However, that began to change, and they were appreciated more as special in the family. Another thing Aries points out is that the idea of children and sex. So it wasn't uncommon for, in poorer families, everyone sleeps in the same room, people sleep in the same bed, they sleep naked together, whether they're children or adults. And it wasn't seen as that it was perverse. Now that would be, we would think that's a big no-no. But even in wealthier families, there's lots of poetry, lots of things written about fathers and mothers and kids running around naked, and the father making fun of the kids' private parts and just teasing and touching each other, because it wasn't considered that they were sexual. It was considered that they were sexually not innocent, but sexually, like they were asexual. It wasn't sexual at all. There was no sexuality to it. They're just naked people. Now, and then as time passed, when the clergy became more and more important to family life and to schooling, the clergy, priests especially, wanted to protect the child's innocence. So they began to separate the idea of anything sexual from the child. And so corporal punishment became more in use, and you got in trouble if you did anything that was considered to be a sin, and you were supposed to be innocent, you were supposed to be pure. That brings me to schooling. So in the medieval times, and beyond even, only men and boys learned. They were not organized by nursery school, kindergarten, first grade, or by age. They were organized into groups to study if they had money. So that's the generalization, but that's what happened. So age didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't ascribe, certain psychological qualities to children who were in kindergarten or in first grade, or what they should have learned by then, and things like that. That wasn't a thing. But as we began to teach, as they began to teach boys and men in groups that were by age, we gradually evolved to the kind of education system we have now. What else? Yep. Okay, last. The idea of the nuclear family, which I touched on before, didn't happen in the Middle Ages. So, but as time passed, it became more and more important for the family to be just with the family. They might have their own dwelling that they may not have had before, shared with other people. They're not sharing with other people up until this time period, at the contemporary time period. So you would consider the mother, the father, the kids living in the house, living in the whatever dwelling they have together, and there was more of a focus on privacy rather than sociability. So, but his argument, he's arguing against the idea that the nuclear family is being fragmented now. Well, this was 1960s, but his argument is that it was never the nuclear family that we have now historically. So it's not being fragmented because it's always changing, I think. And if you look at now, even now, I would say now more than ever, children are brought up by different members of the family. They have a mother that's bringing them up, a father that's bringing them up, two mothers that are bringing them up, whatever the organization of the family has definitely shifted. And now I think, I mean, when I was a kid, when we had Thanksgiving, for example, just throw that holiday out there, it was just our family. It was a grandma and grandpa and my family. And that still carries on to today. About 10 years ago or something, a friend of mine invited me to Thanksgiving dinner, and I was like, okay, because I wasn't planning anything. And then her brother, who I'd never met before, said, well, I thought it was just going to be the family. So I got uninvited. Sort of funny. And even though he'd never met me, because he wanted it just to be the family. So, but I think if you look at things now, when I have Thanksgiving, I have my husband, I have friends, I have friends of my kids, I have, a variety of people. So maybe that's not seen as an insular family either, but things are more fragmented than even then when Aries was writing his treatise. And I think that's about it for him. And the next thing that I'll talk about is in the next video is about the history of children's literature, which is the document that we have. And I'll talk about some of the main points of that. So I am signing off, and I'll talk to you soon.